Sir William Lucas. He managed to go from being someone lowly in trade all the way up to the knighthood. What are his secrets? How was he so successful in his social climbing in the Regency era? And what tips can you learn from him in case you end up in the Regency era and want to social climb too? Well, that is what we're going to be talking about here in today's episode of Brit Lit 101, where we read classic literature chapter by chapter and discuss the world it was written in. My name is Ellie Dashwood, and this is my channel. If you love anything like history and literature, then definitely subscribe. So, the secrets of Sir William Lucas. So today we are going to be covering chapter 5 of Pride and Prejudice. We're also going to be discussing his social climbing secrets and being a mayor and a knight in the Regency era. There's lots of stuff going down today, guys. But first of all, we need to all get on the same page, literally by reading Pride and Prejudice, chapter 5. Chapter 5. Within a short walk of Longbourn lived a family with whom the Bennets were particularly intimate. Sir William Lucas had been formerly in trade in Meryton, where he had made a tolerable fortune and risen to the honor of knighthood by an address to the king during his mayoralty. The distinction had perhaps been felt too strongly. It had given him a disgust to his business and to his residence in a small market town, and quitting them both, he had moved with his family to a house about a mile from Meryton, denominated from that period Lucas Lodge, where he could think with pleasure of his own importance and, unshackled by business, occupy himself solely in being civil to all the world. For, though elevated by his rank, it did not render him supercilious. On the contrary, he was all attention to everybody. By nature inoffensive, friendly, and obliging, his presentation at St. James had made him courteous. Lady Lucas was a very good kind of woman, not too clever to be a valuable neighbor to Mrs. Bennet. They had several children. The eldest of them, a sensible, intelligent young woman, about 27, was Elizabeth's intimate friend. That the Miss Lucases and the Miss Bennets should meet to talk over a ball was absolutely necessary, and the morning after the assembly brought the former to Longbourn to hear and to communicate. "You began the evening well, Charlotte," said Mrs. Bennet with civil self-command to Miss Lucas. "You were Mr. Bingley's first choice." "Yes, but he seemed to like his second better." "Oh, you mean Jane, I suppose, because he danced with her twice. To be sure, that did seem as if he admired her. Indeed, I rather believe he did. I heard something about it, but I hardly know what. Something about Mr. Robinson?" "Perhaps you mean what I overheard between him and Mr. Robinson. Did not I mention it to you? Mr. Robinson's asking him how he liked our Meryton assemblies, and whether he did not think that there were a great many pretty women in the room, and which he thought the prettiest, and his answering immediately to the last question, 'Oh, the eldest Miss Bennet beyond a doubt. There cannot be two opinions on that point.' Upon my word. Well, that was very decided indeed. That does seem as if, but however, it may all come to nothing, you know." "My overhearings were more to the purpose than yours, Eliza," said Charlotte. "Mr. Darcy is not so well worth listening to as his friend, is he? Poor Eliza, to be only just tolerable." "I beg you would not put it into Lizzie's head to be vexed by his ill treatment, for he is such a disagreeable man that it would be quite a misfortune to be liked by him. Mrs. Long told me last night that he sat close to her for half an hour without once opening his lips." "Are you quite sure, ma'am? Is not there a little mistake?" said Jane. "I certainly saw Mr. Darcy speaking to her." "Aye, because she asked him at last how he liked Netherfield, and he could not help answering her. But she said he seemed very angry to be spoken to." "Miss Bingley told me," said Jane, "that he never speaks much unless among his intimate acquaintance. With them he is remarkably agreeable." "I do not believe a word of it, my dear. If he had been so very agreeable, he would have talked to Mrs. Long. But I can guess how it was. Everybody says that he is ate up with pride, and I dare say that he had heard somehow that Mrs. Long does not keep a carriage and had to come to the ball in a hack chaise." "I do not mind his not talking to Mrs. Long," said Miss Lucas, "but I wish he had danced with Eliza." "Another time, Lizzie," said her mother, "I would not dance with him if I were you." "I believe, ma'am, I can safely promise you never to dance with him." "His pride," said Mrs. Lucas, "does not offend me so much as pride often does, because there is an excuse for it. One cannot wonder that so very fine a young man, with family, fortune, everything in his favor, should think highly of himself. If I may so express it, he has a right to be proud." "That is very true," replied Elizabeth, "and I could easily forgive his pride if he had not mortified mine." "Pride," observed Mary, who piqued herself upon the solidity of her reflections, "is a very common failing, I believe. But all that I have ever read, I am convinced that it is a very common indeed, that human nature is particularly prone to it, and that there are very few of us who do not cherish a feeling of self-complacency on the score of some quality or other, real or imaginary. Vanity and pride are different things, though the words are often used synonymously. A person may be proud without being vain. Pride relates more to our opinion of ourselves, vanity to what we would have others think of us." "If I were as rich as Mr. Darcy," cried a young Lucas who came with his sisters, "I should not care how proud I was. I would keep a pack of foxhounds and drink a bottle of wine every day." "Then you would drink a great deal more than you ought," said Mrs. Bennet, "and if I were to see you at it, I should take away your bottle directly." The boy protested that she should not. She continued to declare that she would, and the argument ended only with the visit. So that was chapter 5. I feel like I was like stumbling over so many words today, you guys. How are you doing in the chat? Yep, he's just going around wounding people's vanity in this chapter. Well, I mean, the last chapter, but still, the vanity is still wounded. That is too much wine. It's true. Mrs. Bennet has some good points. See, like maybe Mrs. Bennet was just like ahead of her time and should have really been in the middle of the temperance movement. Wounded vanity unit. I always have fun hearing your variety of accents to the characters. I really tried to tone down my accents today, but I feel like it kept coming out anyway. I don't know. Like, I feel like I'm really struggling to keep consistent British accents when I'm reading. For some reason, I can be British when I'm Mrs. Bennet, but I really struggle to be British when I'm Elizabeth. And so, so then I'm just having this big mental debate of like, wait a second. If Mrs. Bennet's British, how is Elizabeth not British? How do I keep this consistent? Anyway, I'm probably like way too in my head about this. That young Lucas is really something. This is true. I mean, he has like very few lines, but makes a big impact on this book. These are some of the additional resources I have on this chapter, which is how to marry up and social climb. We're really going to be breaking that one down a bit here today with Sir William. So if you haven't seen it, it could be a good watch right after this. Also, I have talked about the fact that's a little bit too much wine and things Jane Austen may be trying to address in a short on alcoholism and Pride and Prejudice. You guys know what we need to be discussing today, right? Is Sir William Lucas. We get the entire Lucas backstory very quickly at the start of this chapter, and I think it's just so fascinating because, like, Sir William, he's been everywhere. He's done everything here. And one of the most important things he has done is become a knight. So this is Sir William's social climbing journey we're going to be discussing here today. So, Sir William, we see he originally started out in trade. If you've watched my other videos, then you know that is not a noble profession, is not an upper class profession. It's in fact a very looked down upon profession. He's certainly in the middle class, but he wants to climb up the ranks. How does he do it? Well, like I mentioned in that video on social climbing, there's 4 steps you can take to social climb in the era, and we see him really try to do all 4 of them. First up is get a ton of money. right? Which is something that we do see him do through his profession, which is trade. It says Sir William Lucas had been formerly in trade in Meryton, where he had made a tolerable fortune. So he's making money in trade. And this must have been a significant amount of trade. He must have been in trade on a big scale. Maybe he had multiple shops or was in the wine business, or, there were higher forms of trade and lower forms of trade. But we see him there being in trade. He makes a bunch of money. What does he need to do? Well, he needs to adopt the manners of the upper class, which is something we see him try to do throughout the story. But one of the things he does is start getting into politics, which was definitely the domain of the upper classes in England. As I've spoken about in my videos on the aristocracy, they were the ones who got to rule because they were simply the best people, and that's how life worked, right? So you know what he did? He became mayor. Now you might be asking yourself, how on earth do you become mayor of a town like Meryton in the Regency era? Well, good news. I have pre-recorded me to explain that to you guys. Let's see if this actually works when I try to play it. That we will answer for you right now. Towns in Regency England were highly unregulated. It wasn't until the 1830s that England did some serious social reform when it came to towns and town councils. Before them, there was a whole wide variety of things that could be happening, but one of the most common government types was by charter, meaning that there was a charter that established the town. And this charter laid out the town council that would run the town. For example, it would say, we're going to have one mayor and 5 aldermen and 7 councilmen and a recorder, and that will be our town council. Now, when they put this charter into place, they would have selected however many members of the local community that were usually wealthy and influential to fill these positions. And from that point on, these councils were self-elected, meaning that the council itself got to pick who would be the new member. And council members served for their life, which meant that they had to wait for one of the council members to die before they could recruit a new one. So for example, let's look at William Lucas in Meryton. He was originally a tradesman, and he must have made quite a bit of money at it, become influential in the town. And he must have social networked with the right people who were already on the town council. There was a lot of nepotism and recruiting people based off of friendship in this system. Then when one of the council members finally died and the council was like, hey, who should we pick to be our new council member? They would think of him and be like, William, we need to pick William Lucas. And that is how you would get on the town council. Then once he was on the council, they could appoint him mayor because they also got to decide who held what position on this council as well. However, you did not have to be mayor for the rest of your life, thankfully. Instead, they would take turns because it was more or less a full-time job that could be completely unpaid or be paid up to maybe like £100 a year. It had so much responsibility. It had almost complete executive control with very little checks and balances on that. So how did William Lucas become mayor? Well, he made a lot of money, networked with the right people, waited for someone to die, and got appointed. And then they were like, hey, let's let him be mayor for a while. That's how you become mayor in the Regency. Of course, as time went on, some people were like, you know what? I feel like this system is not the fairest and could lead to all sorts of power abuses. Maybe we should reform it. And in the 1830s, they did pass a major reform bill that changed how town governments ran in England. So that was town councils in England. Would you guys want to become mayor? Would you network with the right people to get on the town council? I personally find it rather hilarious that that's how you would become mayor back in the day. And I just think it really shows the mindset they were in of like, this is how life works, right? Like the best people just rule and they get to decide who the best people are. And this is how life rolls. Anyway, but something very interesting is it was actually a pretty hard job to be mayor in the Regency era. They didn't have a lot of people working for them, and everyone that did work for them, such as the constable, would like directly report to them. They were kind of the head of everybody. There was not a lot of delegation happening. So it was more or less a full-time job that they had to do everything from, yeah, oversee the constables and the crime happening to dealing with issues in the town that would come up. Like if a woman's husband deserted to her, what are they going to do to help her? Do they need to order a bunch of potatoes for a family that is starving? They also had to license public houses or basically hand out alcohol licenses and oversee any public property. Like if there are public roads or like if you're by the ocean and there's like bridges and stuff, they have to oversee those. So it was actually a lot of work to be mayor. He's now a mayor though, right? He's moved up in the world a little bit. But how do you take this mayorship to the next level? Well, you get yourself knighted. And to explain knighthood to us, I also have pre-recorded me. I went crazy, guys. I was like trying new things out this week and I'm like, I don't actually really like this because now I'm like, what have I done to my script? It's like mostly just me playing videos of myself. Anyway, but I feel like pre-recorded me still says it better, so we're gonna watch her. When you think of a knight, what do you imagine? Is it a chivalrous soldier jousting for a lady's honor? Or is it Sir William Lucas in Pride and Prejudice? There's clearly a big difference between these two things. So let's talk a little bit about knighthood and what it had evolved into by Jane Austen's time. So originally, knights were warriors who had to earn the honor of knighthood, and they had to abide by a code of chivalry, and they had to be the most great and wonderful and amazing guys in the planet. Well, at least that's what those in the Regency era thought. They were constantly looking back at knights of old, thinking, wow, those guys were real knights. They truly embodied the spirit of what a knight should be. These guys we have today, they're nothing. Why? Because knighthood had evolved into a social honor that could be bestowed by the king or the queen upon anybody for doing something that he thought was kind of great, or honestly not really doing much of anything at all. And yeah, there were a lot of people in the Regency era that looked at the modern knighthood as kind of a joke, especially because the king was going around knighting people who were low born. They were not even from a genteel background, such as Sir William Lucas was from trade, and the king knighted him anyway. And this is an interesting aspect of Sir William's character in Pride and Prejudice, that to him, this honor of the knighthood is everything. Partly because he is a social climber, and to him, this is a big deal. And to a lot of other people who are of the upper class, though, would look at his knighthood as like, wow, they're making everybody knights today. This isn't really that big of a deal anymore, right? And they would still see other gentlemen, such as Mr. Darcy, even though he does not have the honor of the knighthood, as far superior and outranking Sir William, even with his title. Because again, they're just like the king's knighting everybody up in here. Another important evolution of the knighthood by Austen's time was the fact that there were different levels of it, often called orders, such as the Order of the Garter, the Order of Bath. So these orders were much more exclusive, usually filled with either members of the nobility or members of the different branches of the military. What Sir William was, though, was an orderless knight. An orderless knight was like the bottom rung of the knighthood. It was the thing the king was handing out like candy. Basically, it was called knight bachelor. A way I like to remember this is it's like a bachelor because it has no order. Like if the order was his wife, right? Like you have a knight and you have the order. But no, he has no order, so he's just a bachelor knight. Another fun fact about this is if you are a big Princess Diaries fan, when the queen invents the Order of the Rose, just to, help out the car accident situation, those knights, knighted as part of the Order of the Rose, would hypothetically outrank Sir William because they have an order and he has no order. fun facts here. Though hypothetically, they would, of course, be of a Genovian order, which, depending on how the British felt about Genovia, may or may not be higher than Sir William. They like to think their orders were better than everybody else's orders. So, what was a knight by Jane Austen's time? Well, unless you were of a very extremely high order, you were a guy that the king or queen just looked at and was like, I feel like you did something semi-great. Let me knight you and give you the honor of the knighthood. And that, my friends, is the honor of the knighthood. Yeah, this is like one of the best Princess Diaries scene. I don't know why. I just am always like, I have a parking brake. I can knight someone. I don't know. But she turns down an umbrella. So you can't knight people with an umbrella, is what I remember from this show. I feel like Julie Andrews just has queen vibes. Just like inherently. Like you look at her and you're like, you were meant to be a queen. But apparently, no country's made her the queen yet, other than Genovia. So someone needs to get on top of that. Did the Prince Regent knight people, or could only the king? So I don't know for absolute certain, but I'm assuming that when he was doing the duties of his father, that he could. I had even read that technically a monarch could deputize someone else to knight someone. So if that is the case, then I would definitely assume that the Prince Regent could knight people. Julie Andrews, the queen of our hearts. This is a random fact I learned about Julie Andrews recently, which is that she had surgery that has left her without the ability to sing anymore. Which, if you watch Princess Diaries 2, the singing scene, like, is it Raven she ends up singing with? Like, it's like very like lower key and it's almost like talk singing because that's like all she's capable of now. Which I mean, imagine being the surgeon that messes up Julie Andrews' surgery and makes her not be able to sing anymore. Like that's not a good medical malpractice moment for humanity. Okay, now that we've got totally sidetracked by Julie Andrews, let's talk a little bit about actual knighting and knighthood now. We have becoming a knight. Now, if you think about it, you have to do something or be someone, right, to get knighted. So what did Sir William do to get knighted? Well, it says that he made an address to the king. And of course, the king at the time would have been this guy. So this is King George III. He is the father of the Prince Regent. He is famous in America for being the King George that everyone hated, right? Like, I feel like even in elementary school history class, like King George was just so evil. He was just trying to like prevent all the American people having freedom. And in reality, like he wasn't responsible for a lot of it and had mental illness and like poor guy. Like his daughter died. It's like really sad. He is also the one who would have knighted Sir William. So let's talk about how this actually happened, which is he made an address to the king. More than likely, King George was like traveling through the countryside and he made a little stop in Meryton because the royalty would do this. They would go out and see the country and they'd stop in little towns, and the little towns, like everyone would come out on the main street and like wave little flags and be like, the monarch's in our town, hi, right? And then the mayor would give them an address. And by address, I mean, imagine a little pre-written speech that's like, welcome to our town. Thanks so much for being our monarch. You're so great, right? Like, it's nothing profound. It's nothing like life-changing here. And then in response to that, they would knight the mayor of the town that was responsible for giving them this little speech. The crazy thing about this is that you didn't even have to read the speech if you were the mayor. You could make the town recorder do it, or like anybody else. You're like, you're reading my speech to the king, but you would still be the one who got knighted. You could get out of public speaking and still become a member of the knighthood. So then, immediately after this address and the speech was given, the king would just right there knight the person. And two, Explain knighting. We also have pre-recorded me because this is one of the reasons I was doing the pre-recordings because like I can't like stand up and demonstrate knighting right now. You're Queen Victoria and you want to dub someone a knight. What do you do? Is it like a medieval movie where you touch both shoulders with a sword and say, I dub thee Sir Fitzwilliam Darcy? The answer is no. They had come up with a more streamlined and refined way by the 18th century, and this, my friends, is how you do it. First of all, you would have the man kneel in front of you, such as if he were proposing marriage. If you are the monarch and this man has just been presented to you, there's a good chance that he's already down in that position, more or less, so he can just stay down there. And then you get a sword. If you are Queen Victoria, you usually have courtiers with swords on that can easily hand you one. If you're a king, you might just have your sword on hand. Or take one from one of the courtiers too. Don't you guys love my sword? I did in fact try to borrow a sword from anyone I knew, but apparently people I know just don't own swords. Anyway, you take the sword and you do tap a shoulder. You tap the man's shoulder once. No double shoulder, no double tapping. And as you do it, there is just profound silence. We do not speak of dubbing. This action of tapping his shoulder actually has a name, and it is called the accolade. Now this is a pro tip. As you perform the accolade, be careful. Do not drink a lot before performing the accolade, otherwise you might accidentally cut the guy. Don't do that. Now after performing the accolade, you say, "Arise, Sir Fitzwilliam Darcy." And it's at that moment he stands back up, now as a knight. So this is a very transformative moment, right? Like he went down, not as a knight, and as he stands back up, he is now a knight with a new title. So this is how Queen Victoria knighted people, as did her grandfather. So for example, Sir William Lucas was knighted like this. Someone said, "Arise, Sir William Lucas." And that, my friends, is how you knight someone. So let me look at the comments here. There's so many of you guys. The pink microphone is acting up. This is so true, but I don't think it's the microphone. I think it's the cord, and I'm gonna have to maybe buy a new cord, or like I think it might be coming like unhooked. So it's not like every mayor got knighted. It was more or less if you were just so lucky that the king came through your town, because he wasn't going through every single town in England, or if your town decided to send an address to the king at court, that could also work. So for example, if he has a big major birthday and like the town's like, let us write him this glorious message, and then you have to go to London and deliver it like mayor, and then you're there like delivering it, then he might knight you then too. But yeah, a lot of mayors did end up getting knighted, but like not every single one. Like if, like for example, if the king came through this year and someone else was mayor next year, like you'd be knighted, but that guy wouldn't be knighted, you know. But yeah. I do need a sword, guys. Though admittedly, now that I've filmed it with my wooden sword, I don't know what I would do with the sword other than like refilm that. Other than just start knighting people. I could just knight you guys if I like really love your comment. I'll be like, I can knight you. Okay, so we see him get knighted. What does he need to do next? Well, he doesn't actually need to do this, but he definitely wants to do this, which is presentation at St. James Court. I think this is one of the biggest jokes of Sir William's character throughout the book, which is he's obsessed with St. James Court. He went there once, and now it is his entire personality. But St. James Court was, of course, the palace where they held royal functions at the time. And he is all about it. And he went and he met the king there. And to explain St. James Court to us, we have pre-recorded me again. James Court, it's the place to be, especially if you talk to Sir William Lucas. He will let you know St. James changed his life. But what if you want to go to St. James? What do you do? What is required? Do you need an invitation? Let's talk about this. So in the Georgian era, the royal court was held at St. James Palace, and that's why it's called St. James. And it was open to the public. They even published the schedule of the different functions of the court in the newspapers. They usually had court functions multiple times a week that you could possibly go to. And yeah, you could see it in the newspaper. You can be like, I'm going to that. But of course, was it really that open? For example, could the lower classes aspire to enter? Definitely not. Even though it was technically open to the public, they had different ways of excluding those that they thought really didn't fit. The number one biggest way was the dress code. You had to wear appropriate court dress to get in, and guys, court dress was both extravagant and incredibly expensive. Getting one dress or suit of this court-approved clothing would be multiple times the annual income of lower class families, so that alone excluded the vast majority of the population. Now, what was this dress code? Well, for women, you needed to wear an embroidered dress that gave you the most massive hips on the planet. Like, we're talking giant. Now, these dresses had actually been in fashion in the mid-1700s. By Jane Austen's time, they were no longer in fashion in the common everyday usage, but the court still required it. Basically, even though it was the most unfashionable thing in the world, you still had to buy one of these dresses and wear it if you wanted to go to the court. And the gown also had to be made of really rich materials and silks and embroidery. Something else important to note is that you needed a headdress that had these long trailing lace laplets off of it. But what if you were a man? Like if Mr. Darcy went, what would he be wearing? More or less a very fashionable and expensive version of what we see men wearing in Pride and Prejudice movie adaptations. They would have a coat with tails, a waistcoat, knee breeches, stockings. Yeah, more or less the same getup because they allowed men's fashion to evolve over time, but not the women's. Of course, it would be a very formal version of this though. Like their stockings would be made out of silk. Their coats would have elaborate embroidery. It would be made of very rich textures. Other essentials for men would be a bag wig, which is where your wig's end is tied up in a little black bag with a bow. Imagine if we had that for guys now. Like if you had a man bun, you had to put it in like a little black bag with a bow. Just imagine this reality, guys. Another essential would be a sword, because you never know when you might just need a formal show sword. It wasn't like a real medieval knight sword. It was just the type of sword you take to court. So you get your outfit, you check the newspaper, see when the next court event is happening. You arrive at the door, and there were always like reporters outside, like writing down what like ladies were wearing and stuff. This was a fashion show, guys. But you get inside, and then you meet the king. Or do you? This was where another massive, powerful screening force came into effect called other people. Court events were often packed with the courtiers and the nobility and those who kind of know who should be there and who shouldn't be there. And to get to the king, who was like deep inside the palace, you had to go through multiple corridors and multiple rooms with a bunch of people in it. And they would screen out anybody they considered undesirable, so they never even got to the point where they could meet the king. However, if we look again at Sir William, he has his silk stockings on and his embroidered coat, and he can tell people, I was recently knighted, and he is able to get through all those rooms and all those corridors and finally make it into the presence of the king and be presented to him. And kneeling before the king was one of the greatest experiences of his life, and he thinks everyone else on the planet should go. It's the place to be. Something interesting about the Georgian era is that they like to keep their rules unwritten. It was definitely, if you know, you know, type of culture. And because of this, we don't have an actual list of like, here is who qualifies to be introduced to the king that we do get later in the Victorian era. But one thing to remember about the Georgian era is that they had a much more open court. They had a lot more court functions. The king was a lot more accessible to people, but at the same time, this meant meeting him meant a lot less. However, there were different groups of people who absolutely thought it was their right to meet the king. They didn't really question it, such as, of course, the nobility, but also the landed gentry. We see Mrs. Bennet assume that Miss de Bourgh qualifies to be presented at court. Another interesting thing we see in Pride and Prejudice is with Charlotte Lucas and Mr. Collins. When they get engaged, her dad is like, once you inherit Longbourn, you have to get presented at court. And I think it's interesting that it's not when they get married, it's not right now that he expects them to be able to go to St. James. It's when they become members of the landed gentry that he's like, that's your moment. That's when you can go. And Sir William also assumes that the likes of Mr. Darcy would be welcomed at court, which of course he obviously would be. He was not only a member of the landed gentry, he was the grandson of an earl and incredibly rich. And cute, I hear, which was not actually a requirement, but I mean, you know. I'm sure that bouncers at the door would be like, you're cute, you're getting in. Okay, not really. What we've learned is that Darcy gets to go to court because he's cute. But other than that, let me see some of the comments here. Okay, yeah, the court dress for women was insane. Like, sometimes court would get really, really packed. Like, the rooms inside the palace were actually not that spacious. And that's one of the reasons that these events had to take place throughout multiple rooms, other than it allowed people to screen people out. But I was like, they would have more space if the skirts weren't so big. But clearly that was not a consideration here. Did the dressmakers make a ton of money? Yes, and it's actually very interesting because a lot of the fashion in the English court was, of course, based off the fashion in the French court. And after the revolution, that fashion was like less needed because, you know, they beheaded the king and the queen in France. But after that, then Napoleon's like, you know what? The like clothing industry is really, really struggling. So he was like, let's bring it back. Like, when I'm emperor, we're going to have to bring back the court fashion in order to revitalize the economy there on the fashion industry. Because it's like, this was a lot of money they were spending on these outfits. Yeah, the hips are so huge. Again, like, you're taking up the space of like 3 people. This is not good space management for a court here, guys. This is a great question because it moves us on to what we're going to talk about next, which is, why was he disgusted with trade afterwards? Because we definitely see him no longer want to be in trade. He's all about being civil to all the world. He got his title, and now he is quitting trade. Why? And actually, one of you guys had a great answer here, which is trade was lowbrow here, and being a knight was highbrow. Basically, the ultimate goal of a social climber from the middle class is, after they've acquired enough wealth from trade, they would transition into being a member of the landed gentry, which is where you would go. You would buy land, you would buy an estate. We actually don't know how much land Sir William's able to buy. He definitely buys a house and he renames it Lucas Lodge. And so we don't know if he just bought the house and maybe like, you know, traditional like house plot of land, or if he was able to actually buy an estate and make the full transition. But one thing we do know about his money is that it wasn't actually enough for this full transition from being in trade to being a member of the landed gentry, because let's look at marrying off Charlotte really quick. So one of the best ways to also elevate your social status was to marry off your daughters to landed families, the upper class, and ideally nobility, but like, not a lot of people were able to pull that off. And as I talk about in the social climbing video, the way you would want to do that is by giving them massive dowries, right? But the thing is, we have Sir William here quitting trade before he's made enough money to give Charlotte a decent dowry. The book says that they were able to give her little fortune. She was a woman of small fortune. Basically, they weren't able to give her enough money to be able to marry up. However, Charlotte, seeing an opportunity, was able to still get Mr. Collins, who's going to end up a member of the landed gentry once Mr. Bennet dies, which as we discussed last week, has happened. So that means like Charlotte and Mr. Collins are now moving into Longbourn as we speak. We're just going to live in this reality. Like, yep, now that Mr. Bennet's died, they are in possession of Longbourn. But basically, I just find it very interesting that it's like he does a lot of things in the social climbing guide. This is one that he doesn't do it the right way by giving his daughter a bunch of money, but he still manages, mostly through her means, to get her well married off and complete the social climbing journey. Is he so courteous, right? Like, but he's not supercilious. And I think this is something very interesting in his character. He is like very friendly. He's always trying to run around helping people, but he's also just such a social climber that he can't fit into the upper class. He's constantly talking about St. James because he thinks that's like his ticket in. Like he finally qualified to go to St. James and be introduced to the king, and he's this knight now. And then like everyone he tries to talk to about it is like, okay, like that's not that exciting. Like it's one of those things where like you think all the cool kids are super into something, so you do that, and then like none of them actually care. Now, St. James was definitely dominated by people who were actually very actively interested in politics and getting certain bills through the House of Lords. But it wasn't like the ultimate social upper class regular event that he thinks it is, right? Like that's why he's always like, Darcy, do you go to St. James a lot? And he's just like, no. Right. And so he does kind of struggle to fit in to the upper class now that he is moving more in their circles. So, how are you guys doing in the chat? Aw, thank you so much, guys. I always forget that you guys are able to send me like super chat stickers and stuff. Yeah, it is interesting that Austen specifically says he's not supercilious. And yeah, he's really not. And I feel like that's the thing. He is a very inoffensive, kind of like lovable guy that is just kind of funny. And I was thinking this a lot about Jane Austen's characters. They're funny. And that's one of the reasons her books, I feel like, are such a safe space for people throughout history, is because if you read other books, like for example, like if you read Frances Burney books, she's a great character writer, but so many of her characters are completely unbearable. Like just reading scenes, I'm like, I want to not read this because I can't handle this character. Where Jane Austen writes characters that even if she's sort of poking fun at them, like they're still lovable or they're just funny. Like even like Lady Catherine de Bourgh, like her scenes are funny. She's not meaning to be funny, but she's still hilarious. It's always like, okay, what's Lady Catherine about to say next, right? And Mrs. Bennet did outlive Mr. Bennet. And now here's the big question, because I was thinking about this too, of like, where's Mrs. Bennet? Which daughter do you think she's living with? Or do you think they have her in her own cottage? Because I feel like of all the daughters that would probably end up with Mrs. Bennet, it would probably be Jane. Like poor Mr. Bingley, because like she has enough money to like support her, and she's Jane. She's like not gonna turn down her mom, you know. If a king was in a good mood, he may not you. Pretty much. He was like, you get like I read this one thing of like where he almost accidentally knighted the wrong person because you could have someone else read your speech for you. He almost like knighted the guy who gave the speech, and the guy giving the speech was like, no, don't knight me. And he was like, wait, why? And I just think that's so funny. Imagine like you're about to get knighted and you're like, I'm the wrong person. They just didn't want to read their own speech. Lady Catherine was the daughter of an earl. That's so true. You know what? Thank you for reminding me of this. Did I not play it? I don't think I did. Did I play a video for you guys about the proper title of knights? I don't think I did. Should we do that now? Because I mean, like, you guys need to know how to properly address knights. The biggest social blunders you can make in the Regency era is to call a knight and his wife by improper titles. But don't worry, we're here today to help you with this. So a knight was a form of honor. However, it was also not as high as the peerage or the nobility, which were actual lords. So first thing is you would never call a knight lord or my lord. That honor is far, far above him. However, you would call a knight sir. The proper usage was sir, first name, last name, such as Sir William Lucas. In everyday conversation, that would get shortened down to Sir first name, such as Sir William. Something else you would never, ever, ever want to do is call him Sir last name, such as Sir Lucas. That is simply not done and would give you away immediately as not from the Regency era at all. Now, what about knights' wives? Well, they were commonly referred to as Lady last name, such as Lady Lucas. You would never call them Lady first name because that was actually an honor and distinction reserved for a different group of people. Usually the daughters of high-ranking peers, such as earls, got to be called Lady first name. And honestly, knights' wives were simply not that socially distinguished. That's why they're stuck being Lady last name. Of course, it's important to remember that the wives of knights were not actually ladies at all. Technically, they were dames. Ladyship was also for the peerage and their children, but they so condescended as to let the wives of knights and baronets to also be called ladies because dame, let's be honest, is not that great of a title, so we let them be called ladies. What about the children of knights? Do they have special titles? Well, no. They have the common everyday titles such as Mr., Master, and Miss. For example, that's why we see Miss Charlotte Lucas referred to as Miss Lucas. I don't know. Let me know what you guys, would you want to be called dame, or if you had the ability to be called lady, would you go for lady? Dame versus lady here. Oh, so here's an interesting one. And you guys have asked before about Lucas Lodge and the renaming of that. And of course, in the era, they gave houses names. This was just common practice. Like why you would pick lodge. Naming houses was like naming babies. You could pretty much do whatever you wanted. And they probably was like Lucas, Lodge, those go together. Now, like lodge and cottage were usually for like smaller abodes. However, a lot of people throughout the Victorian era, especially when they were even buying bigger houses, they would call it cottage or lodge because they were trying to appear humble. It was a way of trying to appear humble even if you had a really big house. It's like, this is just my cottage. We really see that in Sense and Sensibility when Robert Ferris is discussing cottages with Eleanor. And he's like, I love a cottage. You can have a ball with like 18 couples in one. And she's just like, what? He clearly doesn't understand what a cottage really is because they were just buying giant houses and being like, this is my cottage. So I don't think it was necessarily just for a knight's residence, but it was like there were a lot of lodges being named throughout the 1900s. A hierarchy chart, like for the different members of nobility. Like I have a really old video that I go through the different like titles, but like you have all of the royal family, right? And then you have all the titles of nobility right below them. And then below them are the knights. And of course, even within the knighthood, you had like those with orders outranking those who are lower. Like Knights Bachelor were at the very bottom of this. And then right below them were general, like misters. Let's see. Oh, some people weighing on. Oh, yeah. So I could see Mrs. Bennet like living in a cottage Will it be a real cottage or like, a Robert Ferris cottage? That is the mystery here. Mary Bennet. I could see her living with Mary Bennet. I think Mary Bennet ends up married to someone in Meryton, and so, like, their house would not be as big, and I don't think they would have the income to get her own separate cottage. So, I feel like that's why Jane or Elizabeth are gonna end up having to be the ones. Which, I mean, taking care of your parents is a serious responsibility, right? But it's also, like, one of those ones, it's just like, this has been it's gonna just drive everyone mad. Emma Thompson said that she thought damehood wasn't grandiose enough. It's really not, and I think that's the thing of, like, dame is obviously lower than lady, and that's part of the issue there, right? Like, and I feel like there were people who resented dames, the wives of knights, for being called ladies, right? It's like, technically, the nobility could be like, "That's our title. Like, we don't let your husbands be called lords, but we let you be called ladies? Like, what is with this?" There's just so much drama, guys. Let me know in the comments, would you want to be a knight if you lived in this era? So what we covered today was we read Pride and Prejudice chapter 5. We talked about Sir William's social climbing journey and Regency mayors and the knighthood. And also, bonus, guys, you know who's coming to visit us. This is your first appearance, sir. Come here. Oh, you want to say hi to them? You want to sniff the microphone? Do you want to be knighted? So, Remus has decided that this is time for our beautiful discussion to end. But it was so fun hanging out with you today, guys. Let me know in the comments below, like, what your favorite part of Sir William's journey was. And as always, keep being awesome, because you're awesome. Bye. Say bye to them.